Prime Minister Mark Carney is in Europe tonight, hoping to build trade and defense cooperation with key allies. Canada has pivoted across the pond as tensions simmer with our southern neighbor.
Relations between Canada and the United States are entering a period of unusual tension. President Donald Trump views tariffs as his weapon of choice to exert pressure, and he does not hesitate to use them to reshape how America treats its closest neighbors. In Washington, Trump delivers harsh remarks, opting for sudden moves and tough rhetoric aimed at forcing his counterparts to concede. Meanwhile, on this side of the border, Prime Minister Mark Carney has chosen a very different path. Rather than being drawn into a spiral of tit-for-tat retaliation, he is focused on building a long-term strategy rooted in patience, alliances, and more sustainable sources of strength. The real challenge between the two countries now lies not only in the immediate tariff barriers, but also in whether Canada can stand firm in its position while at the same time opening a new path for the future, one that breaks free from America's long dominant shadow.
Prime Minister Carney announcing yesterday that Canada will be dropping some countermeasures on American goods.
In terms of the strategy here, it's probably a smart play for Canada to really underscore the importance and the value of CUSMA.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has just taken a new step by deciding to ease a series of retaliatory tariffs that Canada had previously imposed on American goods. The impact of this decision will quickly be felt in everyday life. Consumers are likely to notice prices on many familiar items at the supermarket, from fruit juices to other essential products, starting to come down. Canadian businesses that rely on components imported from the United States will also see some of the pressure lifted. At first glance, many might interpret this as a retreat. In reality, however, Carney is making a deliberate move. He aims to underscore the importance of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. At present, roughly 85 to 90% of Canadian exports to the United States benefit from duty-free access under this accord. By removing retaliatory measures on goods covered by the agreement, Carney is signaling that Canada takes the agreement seriously and expects Washington to act in good faith by honoring its commitments.
So as we work to address outstanding trade issues with the United States, it's important, it's vital. We do everything we can to preserve this unique advantage for Canadian workers, Canadian businesses.
The core of the trade confrontation still centers on the metals and automotive sectors. The United States continues to maintain steep tariffs up to 50% on steel, aluminum, and copper, citing national security concerns. In response, Canada has kept in place certain countermeasures on these products. This approach strikes a balance, easing tensions to demonstrate goodwill while preserving the necessary leverage to safeguard national interests. It shows that Ottawa is not relinquishing its advantage, but rather sending a clear message. Canada is prepared to enter negotiations seriously on the most critical issues. Prime Minister Carney has not chosen the path of easy concessions. Instead, he is actively shaping the game, ensuring that Canada can set clear terms of cooperation, rather than merely reacting passively to each move from Washington.
As the trade war with the United States continues, Carney has been focused on diversifying trade, especially with Europe. Canada's energy and critical minerals are top of the pitch list.
Prime Minister Carney's actions are not confined to North America. While negotiations with the Trump administration continue, he has crossed the Atlantic to strengthen ties with Europe. His packed agenda has included meetings with leaders in Germany, Poland, and Latvia, as well as direct talks with major multinational corporations. Canada's objective is clear: to position itself as a safe and reliable supplier of energy and critical minerals at a time when Europe is increasingly anxious about the stability of its supply chains. This proactive approach comes at a sensitive moment, as the European Union has just adopted a new tariff framework with the United States, introducing a baseline 15% duty on many goods while keeping high rates on steel and aluminum. Ottawa is closely monitoring each step while offering proposals for cooperation in energy, resources, and defense security to reinforce its image as a dependable alternative for Europe. Canada's military presence in Poland and Latvia under Operation Reassurance further bolsters the country's profile as both a strong security partner and an economic heavyweight. At first glance, this tour may look like a routine trade mission, but in reality, it is a declaration of autonomy. Canada is opening new pathways instead of allowing itself to be cornered. The contrast in style between Washington and Ottawa is becoming increasingly pronounced. President Trump chooses to escalate tensions, wielding tariffs to pressure allies into immediate concessions. Carney, by contrast, is more patient. He works to ease domestic strain, maintain necessary leverage, and weave new networks of international cooperation. This strategy may not be flashy, but it is steady and lays down long-term foundations for Canada. This is not about bowing to its powerful neighbor. It is about proving that a middle power, by leveraging its resources and alliances, can turn volatility into strength. The months ahead will bring a stern test. Trump will continue to press with tariffs and deadlines, while Carney will counter with partnerships and economic cards. Canada is no longer trailing behind. The country now stands tall, confidently choosing its own path and reminding the world that its voice carries weight.
It's not tenable to have, 35+% tariffs on an industry like this. It's not tenable to have 50% tariffs on an important sector like steel or aluminum or copper, because the inputs that go into the United States ultimately are then borne and paid for by American businesses, manufacturers, right, importers.
In early August 2025, the trade landscape in North America grew darker than ever. In Windsor, many auto workers were anxious, uncertain whether their jobs could withstand the wave of new policies. In New York, a family-owned toy shop was forced to close its doors after more than 40 years in business. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Donald Trump showed no signs of slowing down his tariff campaign. Confronted with this situation, Canada chose not to retreat, but instead to strengthen measures to protect its key industries, support workers, and hold firm in negotiations that will shape the direction of the regional economy. Former International Trade Minister Mary Ann stated that the 35% tariff was an unsustainable burden for both sides. According to her, while Canadian exporters will inevitably face higher costs, Americans will ultimately bear much of the fallout through rising prices. Given the deeply integrated regional supply chains built over decades, at present, more than 90% of Canadian exports to the United States remain covered under the USMCA and are exempt from tariffs, including vital sectors such as autos and energy. Mary Ong's message was clear. Canada needs a high-quality agreement, not just any deal for the sake of ending the conflict. At the same time, Ottawa is expanding trade ties through the CPTPP, as well as agreements with Europe and Asia, in order to reduce its heavy reliance on the U.S. market. This diversification, combined with the ability to maintain the flow of goods under existing accords, has given Canada added strength as it enters the negotiating table.
The Ford government has announced a $1 billion program to provide emergency loans to businesses in sectors hardest hit by U.S. tariffs.
We know businesses are facing tremendous uncertainty, and we will continue to protect Ontario's workers, businesses, and jobs from the impacts of U.S. tariffs.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford has unveiled a $1 billion emergency loan package through the Ontario Protection Fund. The program is specifically designed for businesses in the steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors that are being heavily affected by U.S. tariffs. To qualify, companies must meet basic criteria: employ at least 10 workers, generate a minimum of $2 million in annual revenue, and have previously received support from federal tariff response programs. Loan amounts can range from $250,000 to $40 million, with repayment terms of up to 6 years. The goal of the program is to help businesses maintain payrolls, cover operating expenses, and keep factories running, avoiding layoffs or closures. At the same time, Ford is working to retain major auto manufacturers in Ontario by pushing for tax cuts, calling for a reduction in the GST, and pressuring the Bank of Canada to lower interest rates. This is seen as a proactive step to protect Ontario's industrial backbone, rather than waiting for Washington to shift its position.
On his 200th day in office, President Trump slapped new tariffs on dozens of countries around the world.
Most recent CBS News polls show that Americans increasingly believe the economy is good, but the majority expect prices to rise in the coming months.
U.S. companies, they're navigating these shifts in real time.
While Canada is working to consolidate its position, the United States is facing its own pressures. On CBS Evening News, the story of Westside Kids, a long-standing shop, was highlighted as clear evidence. Roughly 90% of its products were sourced from China, and when Washington imposed new tariffs this summer, the store's entire business model became fragile. Already struggling to compete with online retail platforms, Westside Kids could not absorb higher import costs or declining consumer demand. As a result, the shop was forced to shut down after many years of serving its community. This is not just a New York phenomenon. Small businesses across the United States are experiencing the same fate. Unlike large corporations, with deep capital reserves and extensive warehousing systems, small retailers are hit directly by rising costs while consumers tighten their spending in the face of soaring prices. According to estimates from Yale's Budget Research Office, the new tariffs in 2025 will cost each American household between $200 and $800 per year, a burden falling most heavily on low-income families. These developments expose two starkly different approaches. President Trump has chosen to use tariffs as a tool to pressure Canada into accepting U.S.-favored terms. In contrast, Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney and provincial leaders such as Doug Ford, has taken a different path. Targeted support for domestic businesses and workers, broader diplomatic engagement, and a firm refusal to accept unfavorable deals. In the United States, the consequences are already visible: small businesses closing and families struggling with higher living costs. This is no longer simply a trade dispute, it is a test of endurance. Canada is demonstrating its willingness to endure short-term pressure in order to protect long-term interests, while the Trump administration must answer the question of whether its tariff strategy can deliver results before domestic costs become an unbearable burden.
We'll be putting a initially small tariff on pharmaceuticals, but in 1 year, 1.5 years maximum, it's going to go to 150%, and then it's going to go to 250%, because we want pharmaceuticals made in our country.
President Trump has just unveiled what is considered his toughest trade move to date, this time aimed squarely at the pharmaceutical sector. He announced a phased tariff plan, starting at a low rate and rising to 150% within a year, with the potential to climb as high as 250%. The goal, in his words, is to force pharmaceutical corporations to bring their production lines back to the United States. At first glance, this appears to be a nationalistic move, justified as a way to safeguard national health security. However, the scope of this policy extends far beyond the initial rhetoric. The European Union now faces a 15% tariff on pharmaceuticals exported to the US, and India, long a major supplier of generic drugs and active pharmaceutical ingredients to the American market, has also been targeted, particularly as it continues purchasing oil from Russia, a move that has prompted Washington to threaten even higher tariffs. And Canada cannot be overlooked. Although not explicitly named in the early rounds of negotiations, Canada is deeply tied into the pharmaceutical supply chain with the United States. This means Ottawa is unlikely to escape the new pressure, and sooner or later will have to confront the direct impacts on its domestic industry.
I was going to say, for Canadians, what the issue becomes is that our sticker price may have to come up, because if they're going to start matching up against prices in the US, we're going to be one of the countries that are pinpointed.
For Canada, the impact does not stem directly from the new tariffs, but rather from drug price control policies. The Trump administration has required U.S. pharmaceutical companies to adopt a most favored nation rule, meaning that drug prices in the United States cannot be higher than in any other country, adjusted for GDP scale. This immediately puts Canada in the spotlight, as drug prices here are, on average, about 50% lower than in the US for many new treatments. If pharmaceutical companies comply with this rule, the almost certain outcome is that drug prices in Canada will be pushed higher to ensure that US prices do not exceed the set limit. The issue at stake is not only economic cost, but also access to medication. Rising prices would stretch provincial healthcare budgets, potentially delaying the introduction of new drugs into the public health system. The repercussions do not end there. Canada currently exports billions of dollars worth of generic drugs to the US, while importing branded pharmaceuticals in return. Turning this supply chain into a political tool risks creating delays, shortages, and even undermining incentives for innovation. This is a serious concern for a country that has already been grappling with recurring drug shortages for many years.
And it's important to note that right now there aren't any blanket U.S. tariffs on pharmaceuticals. As part of that European Union-United States trade deal last week, there was a 15%, and that is already a pretty dramatic increase from the 0% that it was before.
The situation in Europe is no less fragile. Just weeks after the United States and the European Union announced a framework agreement in July, including hundreds of billions of dollars in investment and a large-scale energy purchase plan, the Trump administration unexpectedly imposed a 15% tariff on pharmaceutical imports from the EU. This move ran counter to expectations that the new agreement would usher in a more stable period on tariffs. The tariff hike not only drives up costs, but also undermines confidence in the value of the agreement itself. For European negotiators, the pressing question is, what meaning does a cooperative framework hold if it can be broken even before it takes effect? According to CBS, the EU has agreed to delay retaliatory measures for 6 months, but time is running out. If Washington continues on this path, the already fragile deal could collapse, further exacerbating instability in the global pharmaceutical supply chain, which is already under heavy strain.
Because that was an executive order to bring drug prices down, but then this tariff proposal would, of course, likely bring drug prices up. So it's really going to depend on what these different drug companies do. Do they absorb that tariff? That's going to be a very, very big tariff to absorb, or do they pass that on to consumers and make it more expensive?
Trump argues that the new tariffs will force pharmaceutical companies to bring manufacturing back to the United States. However, building a pharmaceutical facility is nothing like setting up a warehouse. It requires years of development, massive capital investment, and navigating a complex series of FDA approval processes. Some major corporations, such as Eli Lilly and Johnson & Johnson, have announced new investments in the U.S., yet these are unlikely to offset short-term disruptions. In the meantime, costs are certain to rise. Most likely, companies will pass the tariff burden on to consumers by increasing co-payments, raising insurance premiums, or simply marking up retail prices. An executive order originally promoted as a way to lower drug costs could ultimately drive them even higher. And what about the global supply chain? It is far from ready to absorb such a shock. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, from India, advanced therapies from Europe, or finished products routed through Canada could all face delays or be forced to shift supply lines, directly affecting availability worldwide. This may be the boldest move of Trump's second term, but it is also the riskiest. In trying to both control global drug prices and repatriate manufacturing, he is putting trade relations and patients' access to medicine on precarious ground. Without careful adjustment, the consequences of this tariff policy could extend far beyond the economy. They could strike directly at public health.
Following the Swiss president's failure to reduce tariffs on her country after a visit to Washington earlier this week, the Financial Times is reporting that the U.S. has imposed tariffs on imports of 1 kilo gold bars, dealing a further blow to Switzerland, which is the biggest player in gold refining.
In early August 2025, global markets were shaken by an announcement from Washington. President Donald Trump's administration confirmed the imposition of a 39% tariff on imported gold bullion, directly targeting Switzerland, the country regarded as the world's largest gold refining hub. This was not merely a blow to the exports of a small European nation. It was also a clear political signal. No commodity, no matter how deeply embedded in global trade, is beyond the reach of tariff policy from the White House. For Canada, watching developments unfold across the border, this move served as a stark warning. If even gold can be drawn into the tariff spiral, it is entirely possible that other high-value sectors could be next in line. The only thing I can tell you from a European perspective right now is that all shipments are on hold, a source said. So basically, there's no trading of gold bars between the Atlantic until the first week of August. Most traders still believe that gold bullion would be spared from the tariff spiral, the 400-ounce bars used by central banks, the 100-ounce bars traded on COMEX, and the 1-kilogram bars common in Asian markets were all thought to be outside the scope of the policy. However, the situation changed entirely when a Swiss refinery received an official notice from U.S. Customs confirming that under tariff code 7108-13-50, all of these forms of gold bars would be subject to the 39% duty. The immediate impact was severe. Overnight, gold shipments between the U.S. and Europe came to a halt. Gold prices in the United States surged above those in Europe, creating a sharp divergence. U.S. trade data showed that as early as January 2025, gold imports had reached 43 tons, nearly double the domestic refining average of 22 tons per month, as buyers rushed to stockpile ahead of any changes. Now, that stockpile remains the only supply available to fill the gap in the market. For the global economy, this is about more than just prices. This was a genuine supply chain shock. For Canada, the message is crystal clear. Gold may not be a key export, but the same logic could just as easily apply to strategic minerals, energy products, or high-tech manufacturing. Ottawa understands that even sectors once thought to be secure under the USMCA could become targets at any moment. The lesson from the gold shock is that trade flows built over decades can be cut off with a single enforcement order. With Trump continuing to highlight bilateral trade imbalances, Canada's surpluses in certain sectors could face scrutiny in the same way Switzerland has just experienced.
We have a lot to do in this country. We have a lot positive to do in this country, building this country in a way, building one Canadian economy.
I have all the confidence in the world in the Prime Minister. Donald Trump is very, very hard to deal with just because it's so fluid.
That is why Prime Minister Mark Carney's approach has become more noteworthy than ever in the current context. While Doug Ford has chosen to respond publicly with hard figures, Carney has patiently kept dialogue channels open. Even as Canada faces a 35% tariff, he has strengthened trade cooperation with Mexico, expanded ties with Europe, and at the same time shielded key domestic industries from sudden changes out of Washington. Canada's strength lies in what the U.S. cannot do without: strategic minerals, energy resources, and a deeply integrated automotive supply chain. The fact that gold has now been drawn into the tariff spiral only reinforces Ottawa's determination to diversify its export markets and prepare necessary contingency plans. From steel, aluminum, and copper to gold, Trump is targeting sectors where short-term leverage can be used to apply pressure. The element of surprise has always been deployed as a way to throw opponents off balance, forcing them to concede before they can coordinate a response. But for Canada, this tactic is far less effective. Carney and Ford share the same view. A bad deal is unacceptable. Together, they are demonstrating that Canada will not bow to U.S. pressure without a clear counter-strategy. For Canada, the gold tariff is not just Switzerland's problem. It is a direct warning. Ottawa is combining domestic public pressure with diplomatic finesse, showing that it will not be easily pushed into a passive position. The competition is no longer about who can raise tariffs higher, but about who can adapt and pivot more quickly to the next shock. And so, from steel, aluminum, autos, and pharmaceuticals to gold, one thing is clear. The Trump administration is steadily widening the tariff front, using short-term pressure to force concessions from its partners. But Canada's answer is entirely different. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, and with the coordination of provincial leaders such as Doug Ford, Ottawa is building a more sustainable strategy, protecting workers and businesses at home, expanding diplomacy, diversifying markets, and refusing to accept a bad deal. The lesson from the gold shock, from the turbulence in pharmaceuticals to the looming threats over supply chains, is simple. No sector is absolutely safe. What matters is how Canada responds with patience, skill, and planning. The story is far from over. The months ahead will be a major test for both Washington and Ottawa. One side is betting on pressure, the other on steadfastness and adaptability. Who will endure the long game? We will have to watch closely, because this trade confrontation is only beginning to write its most dramatic chapters.